Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning is a book that every man should read at least once in his lifetime. It's not about whining and self-pity. It's about taking on responsibility for your own actions. It's not about blaming the world for your problems. It's about developing resilience and the raw power of meaning to carry you through the worst times. Frankl, who was a psychologist, a psychiatrist, and a Holocaust survivor, didn't just theorize about what it is that makes us tick. He saw through the worst of depravity that he could see, and he saw through the worst of conditions that men could survive. And he drew some very pertinent conclusions from them. Pertinent conclusions that you and I can embrace and take on in our own lives. Imagine being at the top of the tree. Imagine having a successful practice, a profession, a life, an earning, and doing well. And then imagine having that taken away from you and having to suffer the worst kinds of depravity. How would you deal with it? I'd like to think that I would be able to maintain a sense of purpose. I'd like to think that I'd be able to hold on to some sense of meaning. I'd like to think that. As Viktor Frankl says, between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. So freedom isn't about doing whatever you want. It's about having the ability to choose the destiny that you wish to cut for yourself going forward. And I think that this is one of the reasons that Man's Search for Meaning is an important book, because it doesn't wallow or encourage anybody to wallow in self-pity. And especially in an era such as ours, where there is so much victimhood peddled by so many different outlets, it's refreshing to read something which, like a bucket of cold water, just tells you to man up and take responsibility for yourself. Viktor Frankl was inspired greatly by Nietzsche, and Nietzsche's quote, "You can endure any suffering as long as you have a strong enough why." And it was on this basis that Viktor Frankl started to look at the people around him in the concentration camp at Auschwitz and notice that there were certain characteristics that those people who fell by the wayside and who gave up seemed to share with each other. And there were also certain characteristics that those people who survived and managed to prevail shared with each other too. And he took it upon himself to study this and to work out what it was that made the survivors survive and the non-survivors fail. Of all of the reading that I did of this classic book, for me, the most effective, meaningful takeaway phrase was this: we had to teach despairing men that it did not really matter what we expected from life, but rather what life expected from us. And I think this is a fundamental difference. You have one view, which is a sense of entitlement, that you are put into this world and life owes you something. And you have another, which is a sense of responsibility. And that sense of responsibility equates to true freedom. And it is the idea that you are placed into this life to deal with the expectations that life puts on you, and to deal with them as nobly and as honorably and as purposefully as you possibly can. And so, by observing how people were losing the will to live, quite literally, Frankl decided to evaluate what it was about survival that could be learned and could be applied by people. And I think another valuable message of this book is that we don't have to go to a concentration camp in order to be able to apply the principles that Viktor Frankl analysed, studied and wrote down on our behalf. So now I'll tell you a little bit about those. The key message, I think, that Viktor Frankl promoted was that if you find your why and if you have a strong enough purpose or meaning in your life, you can endure any kind of suffering. And he and his colleagues who did endure any kind of suffering were the living proof of this. Part of the formula for survival was that the people who survived would have an idea, a goal, a strategy, or a sense of purpose about what they were going to do when they survived the ordeal. Whereas the people who didn't survive largely gave up. They lived from day to day in a robotic kind of state, and eventually they just lost the will to live, quite literally. It's very fitting that we should be discussing a book which was inspired by the events in Auschwitz, because on the 27th of January this year, 2025, it was the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. Viktor Frankl found himself in Auschwitz amongst all the degradation, pain and horror of being in a Nazi concentration camp. And as a psychoanalyst and a psychologist, he studied and evaluated what was going on around him and came to some stunning conclusions about what enables us as a species to survive. And so Frankl saw how men crumbled under the weight of Auschwitz while many others held their integrity. And the difference was the meaning. The ones who saw themselves as victims and gave in to despair withered away, and the ones who focused on something greater, be it the memory of a loved one or a goal or a strategy or a sense of purpose, or just the desire to maintain their honour, found strength that nobody could take from them. In short, they refused to engage in the process of learned helplessness. So thank you for listening thus far. I think I'd like to talk about Meditations by Marcus Aurelius next, another important book which can teach us all so much about life and how to deal with it. If you enjoyed this, like and subscribe, etc., etc., and I'll catch you next time. Thank you.